The Joe Rogan Experience.
This goes back to like the regulatory reform thing, which is like there's just like tremendous amount of this that may have been good intentioned at one point.
Yeah.
But sitting here today, we're living with these horrible downstream consequences. And unless somebody steps in with a hammer, none of this is going to happen.
And they also
going to
have
change.
the insane amount of money that's involved because R.J. Reynolds, these tobacco companies, when they were getting sanctioned, they were getting in trouble, they decided, well, let's buy all these food companies.
Right.
And so now these same companies that lied about whether or not cigarettes are addictive and cause cancer, now these same companies are pushing super unhealthy food on people, or at least selling super unhealthy food people, which I think you should be allowed to buy.
Right.
I think you should be allowed to buy whatever the fuck you want. I'm all for that. But I do think we should be like much more aware of what's actually going on, like you're saying, and why this stuff is in there in the first place.
Right. Well, and then you get into these other, more delicate questions, but it's like, okay, food assistance programs for like, low-income people and low-income children. It's like, okay, should they be... Do we want little kids who have no control over this to end up on the receiving end of this food production pipeline, paid for with government money and being 300 pounds by the time they're 18?
Right, and cheaper than other food.
And cheaper than other foods because they're subsidized.
Right.
Because they're subsidized. And so, and you have this very perverse outcome where you have these government officials who have been standing up there for 40 years saying, we're protecting you, and what's been happening is they've been poisoning us.
Yeah.
And so stuff like it just needs to stop. And that's where you need something like the DOGE.
So
and somebody like President Trump.
What would they be able to do to mitigate a lot of these issues? Like, how would they, if you want to, would you make it illegal to put high fructose corn syrup as an ingredient, or would you simply stop subsidizing? Like, and what would be, how would that work within the government? Like, how would you apply something like that?
Yeah, I think there's three things you can do, two of which involve direct action, and then the third is maybe even the most important. So one is you can just stop doing things that are harmful. You can stop doing things. The government can stop subsidizing bad things. That's an example. I'll give you it's a parallel thing. If you want to clean up the universities, you need to stop feeding them student loans, right? So the government should stop paying for things that are clearly harmful. So that's one. And then two is, look, there may be a role for additional protections or prohibitions. And so, for example, maybe you let people freely buy all the Oreos they want, but maybe you can't get them with food assistance programs so that, kids who have no control over it are not being poisoned. And so, you maybe do that. But I always think that the third thing is culture. Like, there's always a temptation with these discussions because the government's so powerful to talk about what the government does or doesn't do. And I think so much of this has to do with the culture. It's actually upstream or downstream from politics, which is like what is the cultural tone of the country?
Right.
What's the value system?
Right.
What are the role models? Right.
Right.
What are people being inspired to do? Also, what form of shaming is in effect? Like, what are we not going to tolerate? Take the perverse fat studies. Like, are we going to glorify obesity? Right.
Right.
No.
And
that's not necessarily a legal judgment or a court case, but it's a cultural statement. And it's not that the government should control the culture, but our leaders certainly play a big role in that.
Yeah.
And so both in and outside of government. And so for our leaders to step up at a moment like this and basically say, yeah, no, this is not the kind of culture we're going to have. It's not the kind of society we're going to have. It's not what kids should be looking up to. I think is just as powerful as the actual government actions.
It's interesting you're saying the kind of shaming, because I don't want to shame anybody for being fat, but boy, does that work.
Well, maybe you should shame
fat shaming works.
And maybe you should shame parents if their kids are fat.
Yeah.
Right?
The problem is
there's
so many people that are ignorant as to what exactly is going on.
Of course, and it's like absolutely required. Like,
and they're being fed bullshit.
100%. And yes, but again, it's also cultural, which is just like, okay, is the media thing, like, is the media educating people on this? And if the mainstream media is not doing it right, should there be new media sources that are? And like, who gets in which source? And then therefore, which sources in the media get respect? Right. And so we have this giant collective culture question,
right,
that we all get to ask and answer, and particularly those of us in a position to be able to send messages that a lot of people hear.
So that will help.
Yeah.
That will help move the needle. And but what specifically can RFK Jr. do once he actually gets in? I mean, there's.
Well, yes, tremendous. He'll have, as Secretary of HHS, he has very broad, I would say, a very broad ability to look at this holistically inside the government.
What kind of pushback is there going to be against that? Like, that seems like a wild amount of money is going to be lost.
Yeah. So there's the work that the cabinet secretaries like he will be doing formally. And then there's the work that the DOGE and the president will be doing kind of in parallel with that. And, there will be some convergence between those. We'll see, there's the potential here for quite dramatic action on a lot of these fronts.
Could you imagine if you're running an agency and you have to have a meeting with Vivek and Elon?
Yes.
And you got to open your books.
Yes. Yes.
It's like Office Space where they brought in the Bobs for consulting.
Yes.
What do you do here?
Exactly. That's exactly what it's like. Is there a meme like that? Isn't there a meme like that? I think there's a meme where they take those guys and they put Elon and Vivek's heads on them.
Yes. So there was another key timeline split that happened in Silicon Valley about 2 years ago, actually 2.5 years ago, when Elon was actually right before he took over Twitter, where he got in an email fight with the CEO of Twitter at the time, who's actually a guy who's a friend of mine, who's a really good guy, but this guy had just been promoted from engineering to run the company, and then like a month later, he ends up trying to deal with the Elon situation, so kind of got a little bit sandbagged on it, but yes. Yes.
Of course he said. Elon Musk says he rewatched Office Space to prepare for DOGE. Of course he did.
Of course he did.
Fucking psycho.
Exactly.
God, we're so lucky that guy's around.
Exactly. So there was this moment in the Twitter takeover where Elon sends his email and he says, and the line is, what did you get done this week?
Whoa.
What did you get done this week? And in the context of Silicon Valley companies, that was a provocative statement because a lot of Silicon Valley companies take months or years to do anything. But imagine that statement being applied to the government.
Oh my God.
Right? Like the level of like accelerated time, like, okay, what are the problems? How are we going to fix them? And what have you gotten done this week?
Yeah, you think debanking upended some lives.
Yes, exactly. So yes, what have you done this week? And by the way, when Elon runs this, it's actually interesting. A guy just tweeted or posted or zeeted what it's like to work for Elon at his AI company, XAI. And he said Elon came in last week and he said Elon spent 18 hours at the office and in 5-minute chunks. And it was each person had a 5-minute speaking slot to explain to Elon what they were doing.
Wow.
And he did that for 5 times whatever, right? 18 hours.
Jesus Christ.
And so think about what that meant. Every employee had an opportunity to tell the big boss what they were working on. Every employee had an opportunity to be recognized for their effort. Every employee had an opportunity to get live feedback from the big boss who had a comprehensive overview of everything as to what they should be doing.
Whoa.
And there's no place to hide. Right.
Whoa.
And think of how different it is for a company to be run that way.
Right.
Then even the Valley companies generally are quite well run by sort of business standards, and even that, like that's a level of intensity that most Valley companies aren't even close to.
Now imagine that applied to government.
And
it's just.
And again, this is the kind of thing. There's no law there's no reason it can't be done. There's no law that prevents that. There's nothing in the Constitution that says you can't do that. It's a choice. How the government is run is a choice on the part of the executive branch and the president for how it's going to get run. And there's no reason why the government can't literally be run this way.
And here's what's crazy. The pushback against even the concept of this by leftists. So leftists defending bureaucratic bloat and big government is wild to watch.
Right. Which they really shouldn't be doing, which is a weird thing to have wedged themselves into. My hope is they'll figure out how weird this is.
Do you think it's like just an ideological thing, like the right wants this, so we oppose it?
I think the left thinks they control the government. Like I think 50 years ago they would have been on the other side of this issue. Like Noam Chomsky 50 years ago would have been on the other side of this. He would have viewed government power as an extension of like the state and big business intertwined. And you have these just term manufacturing of consent, where it's like government and business are conspiring against you.
Yeah.
And so he would have been on the other side of this. But I think today's leftists think they control the government, which in many ways they do. Well, so Washington D.C. voted 94% for Kamala, 6% for Trump.
Whoa.
Right. And so, okay, so 2 data points. That is data point number 1. Data point number 2, 4 of the 10 wealthiest counties in the country are suburbs of Washington, D.C.
Wow. Lobbyists.
Lobbyists.
Yeah.
They call Beltway bandits.
Yeah. That's a crazy job.
Is the actual term. And these aren't people working for the government. These are people making money from the government. Right. These are people sponging off the government. And so, like, yeah, for to the extent that Democrats have wedged themselves into a position where they're defending this, they really shouldn't. They should really rethink this. They should figure out how to get back to the correct mentality on this that they used to have.
Not only that, if there's less government bloat, then there's less tax dollars. Yeah. You don't need as much money to fund these things.
Yeah, that's right.
There's like people can be taxed less. Yeah. There can be more allocation of these funds towards these social programs that we all want.
Yeah. Most federal workers never came back to work.
Really?
Yeah, they work from home.
Most,
yeah,
like what percentage?
Very large percentage, something like half, just literally just never came back.
Whoa!
They still, by the way, still draw a paycheck. They're still on their jobs, but literally they're not in the office. Or in some cases, they have an agreement where there's one agency I probably won't name, but there's one agency where here's another great thing. There are agencies of the federal government whose workforces are both civil servants, have full civil service protections, and unionized. Entirely paid for by the taxpayer, but they both have civil service protections, which, by the way, are totally made up. There's no concept in the Constitution of like civil service protections. It's just like a totally made up thing. And they're unionized. And then there's a particular agency that I know of where the union negotiated the return to the office from COVID, and the agreement was you have to be in the office 1 day a month.
Whoa.
And actually, what the pattern now is what they do is the employees come in on the last day of the month and the first day of the following month. So they only have to be there for 2 days.
For 2 months.
Out of 60 days.
That's crazy.
As a consequence, many of them have actually left the area, right? Because they get their government paycheck, which is calibrated for living there, and then they go live someplace nice, but they go live in the Ozarks or something where it's the cost of living is cheaper and they have a bigger house. And in theory they're working from home, but is it actually happening? So, and this is the DOGE. This is one of the things that the DOGE they've already announced. The thing they've said is you can work from home, just not for the federal government. Oh. Right.
Yeah.
And so when people are talking about is the DOGE going to be able to do anything, it's just okay. There's 50% of the federal workforce. Right, and as a taxpayer, how do you feel about that? And to your point on paying taxes, if those people are in the office and they're dynamos of activity and they're making the country better,
right?
Fair enough,
of course.
But if they're kicking it at home,
right?
Maybe not.
Yeah, maybe not. And
so that's
how much oversight has there been on whether or not they've been kicking it?
Excellent question.
Yeah.
Now it turns out there are ways to figure this out. So, for example, for many jobs where you have to log in to be able to get access, to email, you can actually often you have VPNs to get into the corporate network. You can actually audit and you can see who's been working.
Oh.
And then there's a. Do you know about mouse wigglers?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So,
programs.
No, actually physical.
Oh, they're physical mouse wigglers now.
Yeah, physical mouse wigglers. And so it's a physical device that holds your mouse and then intermittently wiggles it. And a friend of mine who runs a big tech company, he just had a nagging feeling in the back of his head that maybe all of his remote workers weren't pulling their weight. And so he actually wrote himself on a weekend an algorithm to inspect all the mouse movements of all of his employees for a week. And then he bought all 50 mouse wigglers from China that you can buy, and he fingerprinted them all. And he found that he had a whole bunch of employees who were using mouse wigglers.
Wow.
Right. And so how many federal employees are using mouse wigglers? Right. So
how crazy is that that's how they can measure whether or not you're active?
Yeah.
Whether your mouse is moving.
Yeah.
What are they seeing? Just a pattern of movement of the mouse. That's it.
The mouse wigglers move in a way that you can fingerprint detect.
So is this do you agree to a certain amount of disclosure of your personal information while you're working? How do you get access to mouse wiggles?
Oh, so it's very common. So in corporate environments, it's very common that your company issued computer has some kind of software on it that lets the company control the software, and gives the company some level of visibility into what you're doing. And that doesn't mean they're literally watching you, but it means that they have the ability to kind of reach in and be able to see how much is the computer on.
Wow.
Is the mouse moving? And so that's actually a reasonably common thing.
I heard the most ridiculous argument against this.
Yeah.
They're like, what are you going to do with all those employees that get fired? What are you going to do with all those people who are stealing hubcaps? They're making a living stealing. What are you going to do if you make hubcap stealing illegal? What are you talking about?
Yeah.
They're essentially stealing tax dollars.
Yeah.
If they really are doing something that's totally useless,
right,
and we're wasting enormous amounts of money on this every year,
right,
the argument that what are you going to do if those people can't do that anymore is really crazy.
Yeah. Well, the answer is they can do something productive.
Yeah. And people are more than capable. You don't have to infantilize someone to say, this is the only thing they're capable of doing.
Exactly.
They've been working for the government for 20 years. This is all they can do.
Yeah. And then, by the way, there's multiple positive knock-on effects. If you can cut government spending, there's multiple knock-on effects. So one is if you cut the spending, you can cut the taxes, and you can just the private economy then just simply has more money because it hasn't been taken. And so if there's less public spend, there will be more private spend.
Right.
Right, because the money reallocates. And so there might be just as much demand in the economy. It's just coming from people choosing to buy things instead of the government forcing it. So that's number one. Number two, you can bring down government debt, which means you can bring down government interest. And the federal government today pays more in interest than we pay for the Department of Defense.
Right, but how much of that is salary?
No, that's just interest on the debt.
Right.
That's just interest on the old debt.
Okay.
We pay $1.2 billion a year right now, I think is the latest number, which is just interest on debt. It's not paying for any good or service. It's just interest on debt. But again,
what percentage of that is of the GDP?
Well, the total government spending is on the order of $7 trillion. Interest payments are like 1.2 trillion, something like that.
1.2 trillion.
I think
a
that's
year.
the current number. DOD is 800 billion a year.
So 1.2
all
trillion.
in. Just off the top. Yeah, just off the top. And again, no tax. Nobody's benefiting from that. It's just interest payments.